The French Revolution, a very well-known topic that is still discussed to this day, an important moment in history with the strong effects that can still be felt to this day. It's not only a topic of discussion, but also a big lesson from which many following revolutions took their own conclusions. As one of the contemporaries said, in 6 years, France lived more than 600. Many based their interest in the French Revolution exclusively on the fact it was a bloody event that is doubtlessly very interesting to read or discover things about, while others may look at it as a cautionary tale about how revolutions are dangerous and bloody, and why we should never resort to them. As you might assume by now, and rightly so, both of those takes are kind of wrong. The French Revolution had many lessons to teach of us, but none of it is implied there. Although it's a very useful lesson to teach the plebe, especially nowadays, when all the protests are reduced to harmless simulacras of real-life protests. As you may have understood by now, in this video we're talking about the French Revolution. Or more specifically, what was the society that preceded the French Revolution, because that is often an overlooked fact, and is much more important than many could think of. The revolution don't happen in a vacuum, and to fully understand them, we need to first understand what came before. This video will be the first video in a trilogy of videos about the topic, being the second one about the French Revolution itself, and the third one about the ideological impact in the present day. So if you want to help me make them faster, consider becoming a Patreon. When people speak about the French Revolution, they usually start in 1789, when the revolution was already inevitable and on the horizon. But to somehow understand this phenomenon that we call the French Revolution, we need to understand what happened before it. Let's take a look at the 18th century France, one of the world's superpowers, at the time economically and demographically. In the 18th century, France's population achieved somewhat 28 million, compared to only just 8 million people compared to England. Despite many misconceptions, France still was a gigantic economic superpower, with a flourishing economy mainly sustained by its trade and by the vast colonies. Before the 7-Year War that took place from 1756 to 1763, which many call the First World War, France had control over the majority of India and a very big portion of North America. This war basically happened everywhere around the globe and was a big dispute between two big imperial powers, France and England, from which England arrived as a winner, occupying the spot as the world's #1 imperialist power till the 20th century. And now you may wonder why this matters, and it does matter, because both countries spent a similar amount of money in this war, being almost all that money borrowed money from bankers and feudals around Europe. So by the end of the war, both countries had similar debts. But when the victory was decided, those who gave loans to France decided that they need to increase their interest rates, increase them to unsustainable levels. This will reveal a big problem in the future, especially when a decade later, France decided to take revenge on England and almost completely finance and support the American Revolution. By the end of the American Revolution, France had accumulated over 1 billion livres in debt, which is basically translated into 70% of the gunpowder used by the Americans in the revolution. Of course, they not only helped with money, but also with manpower. Many young French went to fight in the Americas, inspired by the Enlightenment ideas. Young Frenchmen that later will return to their countries with the desire for some change in their own state. Many considered that support of this war was not advantageous to France in any way. It was mainly done out of revenge towards the English, because in the end, it did not improve France's situation in the world in any shape or form, and all it did was to drastically increase its debt. The logical question that follows is, where did the French get the money to pay their debts? And to understand that, we also need to understand the French social structure in the 18th century. We have the Kingdom of France, one of Europe's oldest monarchies, with more than 13 centuries of history. A kingdom rooted in feudal social structure, the Free States, 3 pillars of the French society: nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry. Of these 3 states, only the peasantry paid taxes. being the initial feudalist idea that the clergy paid a share by praying for all of us. The nobility paid their share with blood in a battlefield, so the peasantry needed to guarantee that those two other states could do their part by sustaining them. This was a typical feudalist society tax system, a tax system that relied only on peasantry to sustain itself. Basically, every time France went to a war, a new tax was imposed on the populace in order to finance the war. The problem was that when the war was over, the taxes remained there, despite the outcome of the war. So by the end of 18th century, we have this massive accumulation of different taxes that were implemented through 10 centuries of history, which of course reached an absurd level. Many of you may don't know, but it was during this period of time that the famous slogan about taxing the air that we breathe was invented. Alongside with the tax system, there's also the system of privilege, and in France, it had its own peculiarities, which many people many times forget to take in consideration. As I mentioned before, France was a long-lasting monarchy, a monarchy that has been acquiring territories for its existence. For example, here's an image of French territory in the 10th century and the 18th century. With the new territories, new rules were applied to those territories, which resulted in the fact that in the 18th century every region had its own laws and taxes. Combine that with the fact that almost every region spoke its own dialect that were so distinct that someone from the north could not understand somebody from the south, resulting in a big difference between the regions of France in terms of opulence, taxes, and privilege. Everyone had their own set of privilege in France, and of course, the nobility and the clergy had a majority, and the most important ones, like the privilege of not paying taxes. But it will be wrong to say that the peasantry didn't have any privilege at all. In many cases, these privileges were attributed to them as part of bigger groups. Certain guilds and cities had privilege over production and commerce of certain goods. And once again, this right was protected by the law. In the same manner, peasants of certain regions had their own set of privilege. This was done mainly to create a counterpower to the feudals of France and take away political power from them. In this system, the guardian of this set of privileges was the king. Indeed, France was an absolute monarchy in the 18th century, but it's important to understand what absolutism really meant. It meant that the king was the supreme symbol of the French tradition, the main guardian and representation of French governments. He achieved this status through a long-lasting struggle. For example, in the 10th and 11th century, the French king was very weak, in many cases much weaker than other French feudals. Still gradually, with time, the French royal family managed to gain more and more political power by basically giving nobles and feudals more and more privileges in exchange for their political power. Despite the royal French family achieving peak power within the 18th century, it was not truly absolute. The king still was not above many French traditions and laws, sometimes even institutions. Louis XIV, the first of the absolute kings, the son, when passing new laws, still needed to pass them through several French institutions that will verify them before full implementation. This feudalistic system, despite its small and slow innovations, still remained a feudalistic system in its core, a system that was in any shape or form prepared for the industrialization and enlightenment. So let's try to understand what was happening to the system in the 18th century, before the revolution in every state. First, we had a nobility, who was far away from being what they used to be. They didn't have the need to pay a fair tax with blood, mainly because the core of the 18th century armies were occupied by the further state. It didn't mean that they didn't participate, on the contrary, they still occupied higher ranks in the French army. But they weren't needed so much. And also, they changed their main focus to occupying government positions instead, which were reserved for them. They no longer had control over their own land, at least not to the extent that their ancestors used to have. And on a general level, we could say that they were unhappy with the current state of things. Being the interesting thing here, the fact that they were unhappy for different reasons, depending on which category of nobles they belonged to. On one hand, we had small noblemen who were discontent with the current state of things, mainly due to the lack of support that the state was providing them. We could even say that they were economically poor nobles. On the other hand, we had the big families, the big feudals, who fully embraced the Industrial Revolution and intercolonial commerce, which made them even richer than a king in some instances. That specific category of nobles were unhappy with the amount of power held by the central government and the royal court. And third, but by any means the last, we had the new kind of nobles, those newly acquired the status from themselves. Ex-peasants that due to successful enterprises managed to buy their way into the first state. Before the revolution, in France, it was possible to buy entrance into the first state, although technically it was never designed considering that somebody from the third estate could use it. When the revolution came, they constituted somewhere between 1/3 to half of the total first estate. They, on the other hand, were inspired by the ideas of enlightenment, thought that the monarchies are things of the past. They didn't like the lack of political power that they possessed. For sure, they identified themselves more with the big feudals than with the small men. Then we have the second estate, the church, which was also divided and unhappy with the current state of things. Mainly, it was unhappy with the lack of political power for the church. It was divided mainly into big rich clerics that reside in the cities and small poor clerics that reside in the countryside. And finally, we have the third estate. This one was pretty divided and different from each other. In many instances, they will even be different from region to region, mainly due to the fact that there was no universal tax or law enforcement. We had the farmers, small and big. Yes, we also have reports of big farmers who managed even to hoard a small fortune by implementation of new technology, but on its majority they were all very poor and were the first ones to suffer during massive hungers. Then we also have city peasants, who also differ very much from each other. We had people from the first estate that now will be considered millionaires. At the same time, we also had the industrial working class, who were definitely the majority in the cities. They had no rights and were exploited in the maximum capacity by the production owners. Still, they were all united by the lack of privilege compared to the other two estates, and mainly by the fact that they were the only one paying taxes. We talk about politics, social structures, and economics, but what was happening in society in the 18th century? We talk about politics, social structures, and economics, but what was happening in society in the 18th century? Actually, a very interesting process was happening there, which we now call the Enlightenment era, a time where Rousseau and Voltaire and many others were dominating the informational plane. So before we talk about them in more detail, what is the Enlightenment school of thought, or as many of you might have heard, the modernity? Oversimplified, this view of the world and movement implied a scientific and mechanical view of the world, a time when infinite optimism was launched towards the future. With science and logic, they believed that everything was possible. With that approach also came another idea, the idea that we are all equals as humans, and all the differences are socially imposed. It's the time we saw great advancement in science, but also the appearance of new groundbreaking social ideas. And maybe, in other time, this movement would have gone unnoticed by the third estate, but they also live in a time of extreme politicization of our society. It was at this time that coffee shops just started appearing. They were extremely popular among everyone, a place where you could go in the morning, drink coffee, read and discuss the current events that appeared in the journals in the morning. It was a very common practice, even among the third estate. It was also a time that journalism as a profession appeared, being of course all fueled by the mass interest from the part of the population. Knowledge and discussion were extremely trendy. There were dedicated places where people could go exclusively to discuss certain topics related to it, and this applied to all estates. The political life was more alive than ever among the third estate. As you might have understood by now, the French world in the 18th century was very interesting and evolving at an exponential rate. With this video, I kinda wanted to destroy the myth that the French Revolution was a result of hunger or other specific events, which is definitely not the case. There were hungers, riots before, and will be after. There were economical crises and massive poorness before and after. Those kinds of events happen through all French history. But only in the 18th century they combined in a massive snowball with a new political socio-economical thought, alongside with a new kind of society, that put the old regime to a test that it failed, not because of a specific reason, but mainly because it was out of touch with the times. Thank you for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed and learned something new. I will try to do the other two parts as soon as possible, but I don't promise anything. Maybe I'll do something different meanwhile. This video required a lot of effort and time, so consider hitting the like button and subscribe to the channel. Cheers, until the next time.